The sun was dropping fast over the western Pacific. The sea burned orange under the fading light as the USS Ronald Reagan and her strike group cut a steady path through international waters. The formation was disciplined, as always. The carrier at the center, destroyers and cruisers forming a protective ring, submarines sweeping silently below. Fighters were armed and ready on the deck, their silhouettes glowing under the last streaks of daylight. It looked like any other evening patrol, but just beyond the horizon, danger was already closing in. At 6:47 p.m., the first warnings appeared. Long-range radar aboard the USS Shiloh picked up unusual movement, multiple fast contacts approaching low over the water. The signatures were inconsistent, weaving in and out, suggesting more than a routine patrol. The Combat Information Center lit up as officers plotted the tracks. Moments later, sonar screens aboard the destroyer USS Barry detected faint disturbances in the depths, torpedoes or submarines maneuvering toward the strike group's flank. This was no coincidence. It was an ambush. The attack began with sudden violence. From the east, anti-ship missiles roared into the sky, fired from aircraft flying low and masked by the horizon. Their engines glowed as they raced toward the Reagan's formation. Within seconds, the Aegis systems aboard the escorts came alive. SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors launched in rapid succession, arcing into the dusk. Bright streaks slashed across the sky as missiles met in mid-air, explosions lighting the twilight like artificial thunderclouds. Dozens of inbound warheads were shredded before they could reach the carrier. But not all. One missile slipped through, diving low toward the Reagan. At the last instant, the carrier's close-in weapons systems spun up, Gatling guns unleashing a wall of fire. Tracer rounds tore the air, shredding the warhead in a shower of sparks. Less than a mile from the deck, the explosion was deafening, the shockwave rattling bulkheads, but the ship remained untouched. The first wave had failed. From below, the second strike began. A pair of submarines had crept into position hours earlier, lying in wait for the carrier to pass. At 6:59 p.m., both launched torpedoes, their wakes streaking invisibly beneath the darkening waves. But the Americans were ready. The USS Barry's sonar operators had tracked the noise. Alerts rang out across the formation. Decoys launched, acoustic jammers filled the water, and the Reagan's escorts maneuvered aggressively. The USS Tucson, a Los Angeles-class submarine, fired its own counter-torpedoes. Moments later, the sea erupted in muffled blasts as the incoming weapons were destroyed. The ambushers had been spotted, and now the US Navy struck back. At 7:06 p.m., the order was given: neutralize the threat. From the carrier's deck, FA-18 Super Hornets launched into the dim sky, afterburners blazing against the twilight. They climbed and then dove toward the source of the missile launches. Over the horizon, the silhouettes of hostile aircraft appeared, still circling after their failed attack run. The Hornets locked on instantly. AIM-120 AMRAAMs streaked from their wings, cutting across the night. Explosions lit the sky as the attackers were torn from the air. The survivors tried to flee, but growlers moved in, jamming their radar, leaving them blind and defenseless. Within minutes, the air was clear. Beneath the waves, the battle raged on. The Tucson and another American submarine closed in on the ambushers. Sonar pings tracked the Russian-built diesel-electric boats trying to slip away. Mk-48 torpedoes launched into the depths, accelerating silently before detonating with devastating force. The first submarine was ripped apart instantly, the explosion sending debris and oil gushing to the surface. The second tried to dive deeper, hiding in a thermal layer, but the Tucson pursued relentlessly. Another torpedo locked on, and seconds later the sea shook with a second kill. By 7:32 p.m. the ambush was unraveling. What had begun as a coordinated strike from air and sea was turning into a slaughter. The US fleet was tightening its grip, every threat met with overwhelming fire. On the horizon, the final act began. A hostile destroyer, which had lurked far enough to stay hidden, revealed itself by firing a volley of long-range cruise missiles. Dozens streaked low across the water, their engines glowing red in the night. It was the last desperate move to break the American shield. The Eisenhower's escorts answered with brutal precision. Aegis cruisers locked every inbound track, launching wave after wave of interceptors. Missiles collided mid-air in a storm of explosions, fireballs tearing the sky apart. Any that slipped through were met by phalanx guns and CRAM systems, shredding them at close range. The horizon was a curtain of fire, and not a single warhead reached the carrier. The hostile destroyer had revealed itself, and now it was the target. The USS Barry fired back with tomahawks, each one streaking low across the waves. Moments later, the Reagan's Hornets dove again, unleashing harpoon missiles from high altitude. The destroyer tried to defend itself, firing interceptors, deploying decoys, turning hard. It was no use. The tomahawks struck first, tearing open the hull. The harpoons followed, smashing through the superstructure. Secondary explosions rocked the ship as its ammunition ignited. Flames consumed the deck. Minutes later, it rolled heavily to one side and slipped beneath the sea. The ambush was over. By 8:04 p.m., silence returned to the Pacific. The Reagan sailed untouched, her decks alive with recovering aircraft. The escorts reformed their shield. Submarines swept the depths, confirming no further threats. The US strike group had been targeted in a carefully planned ambush, but instead of being destroyed, it had erased its attackers in less than an hour. News spread quickly. Satellite images showed the burning oil slicks. Distress calls intercepted by NATO confirmed the loss of aircraft, submarines, and a destroyer. Analysts around the world spoke in disbelief. A fleet had tried to cripple a US carrier group, and the result was total failure. Washington released only one line: the fleet remains secure. The world understood the rest. For the sailors who lived it, the night would never be forgotten. The sudden alarms, the missiles streaking against the Dusk, the calm orders on the bridge, the roar of interceptors tearing into the sky, and the sight of enemy ships and submarines disappearing one after another beneath the waves. It was proof that the shield still held, that the US Navy could not be broken. For allies, it was reassurance. For adversaries, it was a warning. The oceans are unforgiving, and if you dare ambush a US carrier, the price will be swift, merciless, and final. The Reagan sailed on, her deck glowing in the night, her aircraft rising into the dark sky on patrol. The sea was calm again, but the world would remember what had happened at dusk, when an ambush turned into annihilation and the balance of power was reaffirmed in fire. The lesson of that night was unmistakable. Carriers are not just ships. They are moving fortresses, backed by layers of technology, training, and firepower that no ambush can overcome. In choosing to strike at dusk, the attackers believed darkness would hide them. Instead, it exposed their weakness. The United States Navy showed the world that even in the most carefully planned trap, the hunter can quickly become the hunted. And the price of miscalculation is absolute destruction.